Not the cold of space outside the pod walls, though that was there too, pressing against the 3-inch hull like a patient animal. This cold was inside me. It had settled somewhere behind my ribs about 40 minutes after the shooting stopped when the comms went quiet, and I understood that nobody was going to answer back, no matter how many times I called their names. My name is Yael Okafor. I am a sergeant in the Tern Frontier Security Corps, and I was the only person left alive on Outpost Kessler 7 in the Helion Drift. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because the story that comes after this moment is so large and so loud that the 47 people who did not survive it tend to get lost inside it. They deserve not to be lost. So I am starting here in the pod, in the cold, before anything else happened. The Helion Drift sits at the edge of the Orion Spur, where the spiral arm begins to thin out, and the stars grow sparse and the distances between things become hard to imagine. It is not a pretty place exactly, though I had come to think of it that way. The gas giant the locals called Helios Prime was a burnt orange sphere the size of a small moon, and it had a ring system made of ice and silicate dust that caught the light from the distant sun and scattered it in long pale arcs. At certain hours when the angle was right, the whole drift filled up with a soft amber glow, and you could stand at the observation window and feel, just for a moment, that you were somewhere worth being. I had been stationed at Kessler 7 for 14 months. The outpost was a research platform, not a military base. It sat in the outer ring at a fixed orbital point, roughly 1,200 meters long, and shaped like a series of connected cylinders, the way most deep space facilities are. We had 47 people there. Scientists, engineers, a small security detail of 6, a medical officer, a cook who also handled logistics, and a communications specialist named Pete Garland who made coffee that was so bad it had become a kind of joke that everyone loved. Pete was gone now. I knew that because I had heard his voice on the comms when the outer hull sections went. He had said something I could not make out, and then there was nothing. I am telling you this because I need you to understand something before we go any further. Everything that happened after this moment, everything that the rest of this story is about, everything that made the galaxy stop and stare and go very, very quiet, all of it had a price that was paid right here, in this pod, in this silence, before any response was sent and before any decision was made. 47 people paid it. Most of them were not soldiers, Doctor. Anu Femi, who ran the xenobiology lab, had spent 6 years studying the drift's microecosystem in the ring dust. She had a daughter named Lucy back on Earth who was 7 years old. She used to show me pictures on her tablet during evening meals. The thing that came for us was not something we had a name for yet, not a name that felt real. We had a designation, the Vreth, drawn from first contact records that were mostly theoretical, gathered from long-range sensor passes, and a handful of recovered debris fields that nobody could fully explain. The Vreth were a hive species, arthropod in structure, organized around a caste system that put strategic commanders at the top and everything else below in rigid tiers. They communicated through a combination of chemical signal and low-frequency vibration. They did not use radio. They did not respond to any of the 17 contact protocols that humanity had developed over 30 years of careful outreach. When you sent them a message, you got nothing back. Not hostility, not curiosity. Just nothing, as if you had not spoken at all. We had been told they were unlikely to engage with a research outpost. The threat assessment on the bulletin board in the security room rated Kessler 7 as a Category 2 soft infrastructure site. Low tactical value, low risk. I had read it when I arrived. I had not thought about it much since. My squad mate was a man named Carl Bishop. He was from Bristol, a compact and careful person who laughed quietly and always checked his equipment twice. He had been on the opposite end of the outpost when the attack began. I heard him on comms for about 4 minutes. He was very calm. He was trying to reach Dr. Femi's section to help evacuate the lab team. The last thing he said was that the corridor ahead of him had lost pressure and he was going to try a different route. I think about Carl often. I think about the route he chose. The attack itself, when I look back on it, was extraordinary in how little it resembled what you imagine an alien assault to look like. There were no energy beams tearing through the hull in dramatic arcs. There was no warning alarm blaring for long dramatic minutes while everyone ran. The Vreth approach was systematic and almost quiet. They used focused electromagnetic disruption to kill our power grid in stages, moving inward from the outer sections. Where they needed to breach, they used precision-cutting tools, not weapons in the conventional sense. They were not angry. They were not excited. They were working. That was the detail that stayed with me later, when I had time to think they were just working. I had been in the security hub near the center of the outpost when the lights first flickered. Our section chief, a tall woman named Grace Holloway, had immediately pulled up the sensor grid and said, in a very quiet voice, that something large was docked against our outer hull without permission. She started opening a channel to Orion Command. I do not know if the message went through. The power grid went down fully about 90 seconds after she started talking. We had emergency protocols. The security team had a designated shelter pod, sealed, with independent power, an emergency beacon, and enough oxygen for 48 hours. Grace got me into it. She did not come in herself. She said she was going to try to reach the civilian shelters and help coordinate. She said it in the same tone she used when she was telling me to go check the perimeter. Just a task that needed doing. I have been asked many times since whether I argued with her. I did not. I knew Grace. Arguing would have cost time and she would not have changed her mind. I sealed the pod, I activated the beacon, I listened. The beacon transmitted on 4 frequencies simultaneously, including the deep channel military band that civilian outposts were issued for genuine emergencies. I did not know at the time what that signal would do. I did not know that the Terran Strategic Reserve monitored those channels continuously, or that the moment a distress signal hit the military band with a Kessler 7 identifier, a process would begin on the other end that nobody aboard any of those incoming ships had the authority to stop. I did not know any of that. I just pressed the button, because it was the only thing left to press. The Vreth were aboard the outpost for approximately 6 hours. I could hear things through the pod walls, though not much. Movement. The structural hum of powered tools. At one point something heavy dragged across the hull directly above me, and I pressed myself against the far wall and tried to breathe slowly. They did not find the pod. I do not know if they looked. The security shelter pods were designed to have a low electromagnetic signature for exactly this kind of situation. And either that design worked or they were not interested in searching thoroughly. Eventually the sound stopped. The vibration through the hull that told you something was docked against the outer skin went away. And I was alone. I ran diagnostics on the pod systems to give myself something to do. Oxygen nominal, beacon active, structural integrity nominal. Comms, short range only, no response on any channel. I tried every name I knew. Carl Grace Pete, Dr. Femi, the logistics officer, a young man named Oliver Watts who had only been at Kessler 7 for 3 months and spent most evenings playing strategy games on his terminal and asking anyone who walked by if they wanted to join. Nobody answered. I want to be precise about what I felt in those hours because I think it matters. I was not numb. I was not in shock in the clinical sense. I was completely horribly aware of exactly what had happened. I had been a frontier security officer for 8 years. I had trained for scenarios involving hostile contact. None of that training had prepared me for the specific experience of being the one who was left, the one still inside the situation while everyone else had exited it, permanently. There is no training that covers that. You just sit with it. I thought about Dr. Femi's last recorded transmission, which I had caught in fragments over comms during the first 20 minutes. She had been trying to barricade the lab section and send a data burst to the research archive on New Cairo Station. She had succeeded, the archive confirmed later. Everything she had spent 6 years studying was preserved. Her voice in that transmission was calm and focused and entirely herself, and the last thing she said before the signal cut was the thing I keep coming back to. Tell them we were here. She did not say help us. She did not say tell them what happened. She said tell them we were here. As if the fact of our presence, our small outpost in the amber light of the drift, was the thing she most needed to protect. I sat in that pod for 11 hours before the first human ship arrived. I know because I counted. I had nothing else to do but count. When the lock scan lit up on my pod display, and a voice came through on the military channel, asking if anyone was alive in the Kessler 7 debris field, I tried to answer and found that my voice had stopped working the way voices are supposed to work. It took me 3 tries to get a clear word out. The voice on the other end was patient. It said, "Steady, we have you. We are coming in." I did not ask how many ships were out there. I did not ask what was going to happen next. I found out those things later when the airlock opened and I was brought aboard the USS Carthage and led to a medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air and the particular institutional calm of a warship at readiness. I found out about Protocol Verdun later. I found out about the 47 Lagrange cannons later. I found out what the beacon had started and what it could not be stopped from finishing later. But I am getting ahead of myself. The story, the real shape of it, was still being decided in the 6 hours that followed, and it was being decided in a place very far from where I was sitting, somewhere in the core of Vreth-held space, aboard a flagship whose designation translates roughly as Edge of Reckoning. A commander named Sek Verath was looking at the sensor reports from the Kessler 7 operation and feeling something very close to satisfaction. He had no idea what had just started. Sek Verath was not a cruel being by the standards of his kind. This is important to say. He was a commander of the 3rd-tier war caste, which placed him at the upper end of Vreth military hierarchy. and he had served the Hive expansions for what translated to roughly 40 years of continuous active command. He had conducted 17 probe actions across 6 species-claimed territories. He had never lost a ship to any of them. The Vreth did not think of what they did as conquest in the way that human historians would later try to frame it. From the inside, the Hive expansion was more like an ecological process, the way a forest grows into available space. Territory was assessed, graded, and either absorbed or left alone based on a calculus of resource value and resistance cost. Soft targets were cleared when they fell within a designated expansion corridor. There was no hatred involved. There was no particular interest in the beings who had built the things being cleared. This was perhaps the single most important thing about the Vreth that humans had failed to understand, and it was the reason that Sek-Varath reviewed the Kessler 7 report with professional calm, rather than any sense that something had gone wrong. The outpost had been rated Category 2. It had been cleared per standard protocol. 47 occupants, non-combatant majority, security rated minimal. The clearing operation had taken 6 hours and 11 minutes, which was slightly above average for a structure of that size, but within acceptable parameters. His field teams had recovered useful samples from the research labs, including biological and material specimens that would go to Hive analysis. The distress beacon was noted in the report. Soft targets frequently transmitted distress signals. It was expected. The usual outcome was that a rescue vessel would arrive, find nothing left rescue, and file an incident report with whatever governance body was responsible. Occasionally there were diplomatic protests. Once, from the Thesian Federation, there had been a formal declaration of censure. None of it had ever produced anything that the Vreth Strategic Council considered a meaningful response. Sek-Varath passed the report to the Fleet Archive and turned his attention to the next stage of the corridor assessment. It was one of his signals analysts, a lower caste operative named Vel Herrick, who first flagged the anomaly. Vel Herrick was exceptionally good at his work, which was the only reason a lower caste operative would ever have direct access to a third-tier commander. He had a talent for pattern recognition that the Hive had found valuable enough to place him in a role well above his birth caste's usual ceiling. He came to Sek-Varath's command chamber 17 hours after the Kessler 7 operation with a data plate and a careful, neutral expression. The distress beacon from the outpost, Vel Herrick explained, had not behaved like other distress beacons. Sek-Varath looked at the data. The beacon had transmitted on 4 frequencies, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the 4th frequency, a deep channel band that Vel Herrick's analysis tagged as distinctly different from the civilian emergency frequencies. It was narrow, precisely encoded, and the signal architecture was nothing like a civilian distress call. It was structured more like a military trigger, like something designed to activate something else. Sek-Varath asked how long it would take to fully decode the signal architecture. Vel Herrick said that was not the immediate concern. The immediate concern was what the passive sensors had picked up in the last 3 hours. Fold signatures. Multiple fold signatures, emerging from directions that did not correspond to any known human patrol routes. He put the count on the data plate, 140. Sek-Varath looked at the number for a long time. In 40 years of command, across 17 probe actions, the largest response he had ever provoked from any species was 11 ships. The Thesian Federation, which had the most developed military in the known contact zone, had managed 32 once, in a specific engagement near their colony world. 140-fold signatures, all emerging in silence, no hails, no broadcast challenges, no sensor pings. Just presence, spreading across a front that Vel Herrick's calculations placed at approximately 3 light-years wide. Sek-Varath had the fleet go to battle readiness, not because he was afraid, he would say later, because it was procedure. The human ships held position and said nothing for 4 hours. During those 4 hours, Sek-Varath's analysts worked continuously to understand what they were looking at. The human vessels were large, not elegant, the way the Vreth designed warships, with their smooth integrated carapace forms and compact profiles. These were dense and asymmetrical, built with layers of redundant armor plating and weapon systems that Vel Herrick's sensors kept returning different readings on, as if they were designed to be difficult to assess accurately. They looked like something built by people who had stopped caring whether their ships looked threatening, because they were past the stage of needing to signal threat. They were just threat. Sek-Varath sent a query to the Hive's long-range intelligence archive. He asked for a full assessment of human military capability, specifically regarding fleet engagement doctrine and maximum force response protocols. The archive response came back in segments, and as Sek-Varath read through it, he noticed something that he had not noticed in the pre-operation briefings. The archive had a category marked Deep Reserve, distinct from the standard fleet listings. The entries in this category were sparse, flagged as low-confidence data gathered from secondary sources, and most of them were old. There was a designation he did not recognize, Protocol Verdun, with a single line of analysis attached. Classified Deterrent System, Full Scope Unconfirmed, Cross-Reference Vega Massacre Historical Record. Sek Varath called up the Vega Massacre record. He read it. It was a 200-year-old event, a conflict between early human colonists and a now-extinct species called the Kethdar, that had ended in the total elimination of the Kethdar home colony. The humans had not done it. The Kethdar had done it to themselves, retreating to their home world and triggering a planetary defense collapse during a siege. But the event was listed in the archive as the founding incident of the Human Strategic Reserve Doctrine. The humans had watched an entire colony world end, and then they had built something. He was still reading when the transmission came through. One human ship, one broadcast, universal syntax, the contact zone language framework that everyone used for cross-species communication. Transmitted twice, then repeated a third time clearly and slowly. You have ended 47 human lives. You have 6 hours to transmit your homeworld coordinates. This is the only communication you will receive. Sek Varath read it 3 times. Then he did something he had not done in any of his previous 17 probe actions. He called a full command assembly. His 4 subcommanders arrived in the chamber within minutes. He showed them the transmission. The reactions were predictable. His second-tier combat commander, a veteran named Hraxol, dismissed it immediately. A bluff, he said. The humans were attempting psychological pressure through an implausible threat. No species would commit to a planetary-scale retaliatory strike over 47 casualties from a Category 2 facility. It was not proportionate, it was not logical, it was theater. Sek Varath's logistics commander, more cautious by nature, pointed to the 140-fold signatures and said that the fleet presence alone was not theater. That was real, but real for what purpose? Hraxol asked. To engage the Vreth fleet in open battle? The Vreth had 430 ships in this corridor alone. 140 human vessels, however well-armored, could not realistically fight that force. Sek Varath looked at Velharik, who had remained in the chamber. The analyst, keeping his expression carefully neutral, said that the fleet presence might not be intended for conventional battle engagement. What was it intended for then? Velharik said he did not know, but the 140 ships had not moved into an attack formation. They had moved into a pattern that his analysis software did not have a category for. They were spread very wide, and they were holding very still. Sek Varath looked at the transmission again. You have 6 hours to transmit your homeworld coordinates. The Vreth homeworld sat at the center of the Hive core cluster, protected by 7 fleet screens, a planetary defense grid that had been continuously upgraded for 3 centuries, and a natural barrier of dense star-forming regions that made any direct approach a navigation nightmare. It was, by any military calculus, the most defended single location in Vreth-controlled space. He decided the transmission was, as Hraxol had said, a bluff. He sent no reply, but he found that he could not quite stop looking at the archive entry. Protocol Verdun. Full scope unconfirmed. The humans were, Velharik had once told him during a briefing on contact zone species psychology, unusual among known spacefaring civilizations in one specific way. Most intelligent species, when they built weapons, built them for offense or defense. They built them to win engagements or to prevent engagements from starting. The humans had done both of those things, but they had also built a third category of weapon, one that Velharik described as consequence architecture. Systems designed not to win a fight, but to make certain specific outcomes impossible to escape, regardless of what happened afterward. Velharik had said this in a dry, analytical tone, the way he said everything. But Sek Varath remembered now that he had paused slightly at the end of the sentence, the way he did when he was not sure whether to add something. Sek Varath had not asked him to continue at the time. He wished now that he had. The 6 hours passed. Sek Varath managed his fleet, reviewed corridor assessments, ate a standard meal, and monitored the sensor feeds from the human formation. They did not change position. They did not send additional transmissions. They did not respond to the 2 tentative sensor pings that Hraxol sent to test their awareness. They just waited. At the 4-hour mark, a small ship detached from the human formation and moved toward the Kessler 7 debris field. Recovery operation, Velharik assessed. They were retrieving their surviving personnel, if any had survived. At hour 5, something changed in the sensor picture, though it took Velharik another 20 minutes to characterize what was happening. Fold signatures, he reported to Sek Varath, not the 140 ships. Different signatures, smaller, coming from multiple points along the surrounding light-year envelope, from positions that did not correspond to any of the visible fleet ships. Where are they coming from? Sek Varath asked. Velharic said he could not determine the origin points. The signatures were emerging from positions that the Vreth fleet had not occupied and had not surveilled. They were resolving into objects that his sensors were having difficulty classifying. Large, dense. Not ships, in the conventional sense. They had no engine emissions consistent with combat vessels. They had no weapon signatures that his systems could identify. What they had was mass. Extraordinary mass, moving on precise vectors, already in motion. Velharic looked up from his data station and met Sekvarath's gaze directly, which a lower caste operative almost never did. He said the vectors resolved to the core cluster. Sekvarath was out of his command seat before he had consciously decided to stand. The Hive Homeworld, the 7 fleet screens, the 3-century defense grid, the cradle seas. How many, Sekvarath said. Velharic said 47. The numbers sat in the air of the command chamber and nobody said anything. 47. One for each of the people on that outpost. They had been counted. Each one of them, all 47, had been counted and assigned a response, and those responses were already moving, already inside the fold, already beyond anyone's ability to recall, before the 6-hour window had even closed. Velharic said quietly that the objects showed no drive signature because they did not need one. They were already at terminal velocity. They had been accelerated somewhere else, at some earlier point that his sensors had not detected, and then folded directly into approach vectors. They required no further propulsion. They were, in the most precise physical sense, already finished. The outcome was already determined. Sekvarath tried to open a channel to the Homeworld defense grid. The channel connected. The grid was responding. The 7 fleet screens were scrambling. The commanders were aware of the incoming objects and were attempting intercept solutions. Velharic, looking at his data, said very quietly that the intercept solutions would not be sufficient. The objects had been placed with a precision that the defense grid's intercept protocols had not been designed to handle. The grid could stop a conventional attack. It could stop a conventional bombardment. It could not stop 47 pre-aimed, pre-accelerated, full-delivered kinetic impactors that had been placed into approach trajectories by someone who had very carefully studied exactly how the defense grid worked and built their delivery system around its specific blind spots. This was not a battle, Velharic said. Sekvarath said he understood that. It was a sentence, Velharic said, and then stopped speaking. In the human formation, nothing moved. The 140 ships held their positions and watched, and did not fire a single weapon. Sekvarath's comms board lit up. His sub-commanders were requesting emergency assembly. 3 of his 4 fleet screens were broadcasting distress. The Hive Core Communications Network, which the Vreth had maintained for 400 years without interruption, began dropping nodes. He stood very still in his command chamber and understood something that he had not understood before this moment. Something that no strategic briefing had ever communicated to him, because no strategic briefing had considered it necessary. The humans had not come here to fight him. They had not come here to threaten him. They had come here because the process was already complete, and they were witnesses. They were watching him understand what had happened the way you might watch someone read a document that had been written about them a long time ago. The outcome was in the document. It had always been in the document. They had just waited for him to learn to read it. He thought about the distress beacon, the 4th frequency, the military trigger channel. He thought about a small outpost in the amber light of a gas giant ring system, 47 people, most of them scientists, one of them a biologist who had spent 6 years studying ring dust and had a daughter named Lucy. He thought about the transmission he had received 6 hours ago, and he had not replied to, because he had been certain it was a bluff. He thought about 40 years of probe actions, 17 cleared sites, the clean, efficient logic of the Hive expansion, the forest growing into available space. And he thought about something Velharic had said once, in that dry, analytical voice about consequence architecture. Systems designed not to win a fight but to make certain specific outcomes impossible to escape. He opened a channel to the human flagship. He transmitted in universal syntax imperfectly formed, the only question that seemed to matter in this moment. Why did you name them? The channel was open for a long time before a response came. When it did, it was a single human voice, low and steady without anger, because they had names. Sekvarath closed the channel. He looked at Velharic, who was watching the sensor feeds with the careful stillness of someone who had understood what was happening before anyone else in the room, and had been carrying that understanding alone. Sekvarath told his fleet commanders to stand down from battle posture. He gave the order to begin emergency fold-out. He did not run. He sat in his command chair while the fleet around him dissolved, ship by ship, jumping to emergency coordinates. Velharic stayed until the end. When the flagship was the last Vreth vessel remaining in the Helion drift, Sekvarath told him to prepare the fold drive. Vel Herrick asked if the commander wished to send any final communication to the human fleet. Sekvarath thought about this for a moment. He said no. There was nothing to say that would mean anything now. The sentence had been delivered. The forest had encountered something that did not grow the way available space was supposed to grow. Something that had been very quietly, very carefully, and very completely prepared for exactly this kind of misunderstanding. He thought about a Category 2 soft target in a debris ring around a burnt orange gas giant. 47 people who had not mattered to his calculus. He thought that perhaps the calculus had been wrong. The full drive spun up. The helium drift disappeared. In the debris field, the remains of Kessler 7 continued their slow orbital arc. The gas giant turned. The ice dust rings caught the light and scattered it in long pale arcs, amber and silver, the way they always had, indifferent to everything that had happened and everything that had not. And aboard the USS Carthage, in a medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, Sergeant Yale Okafor sat on the edge of a bunk and looked at the bulkhead and waited to find out what she had started. Yale Okafor had never been on a warship before. She had done her frontier security training on Callisto Station, then spent 3 years on a patrol frigate called the Henderson before being assigned to Kessler 7. But patrol frigates were working vessels, cramped and functional, and perpetually smelling of engine coolant and day-old food. The USS Carthage was something different. It was a Tier 1 strategic response vessel, which was a designation Yale had seen on organizational charts but never encountered in person. It was a 1/4 kilometer long, built around a central command spine with 4 radiating weapon platforms and enough redundant systems that losing any 3 of them would still leave a functional warship. The corridors were wide and clean and quiet in the specific way that high-readiness military environments are quiet. Not peaceful, but controlled. Every sound had a purpose. She had been brought aboard by a recovery team that handled her with the calm efficiency of people who had done difficult extractions before, and knew that what a survivor needed in the first moments was not sympathy but function. They got her inside, they checked her vitals, they gave her water and a thermal blanket and a place to sit. A medical officer named Dr. Claire Yates, compact and precise, ran a quick assessment and told her she had early-stage dehydration and elevated cortisol levels, and that both of those things were expected and treatable. Then Dr. Yates left and a woman walked in who Yale recognized immediately from the briefing materials she had reviewed years ago during a standard frontier security update. Admiral Marie Voss, commander of the Terran Strategic Reserve's primary response fleet. She was a tall woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in command positions, and no longer needed to think about how they held themselves. She was wearing a standard duty uniform without decoration, which was typical for reserve fleet commanders, Yale had read. They did not do ceremony. She pulled a chair over and sat across from Yale and said she was glad Yale was alive. Yael said thank you. Voss asked how she was doing in a tone that was direct rather than gentle, meaning she wanted a real answer. Yale said she was functional. Voss nodded as if that was the correct answer. She said that Yale had been registered as the official survivor witness for the Kessler 7 incident under the Frontier Accords of Settlement, which meant she had the right to remain aboard and observe proceedings from a bridge terminal for the duration of the response operation, or she could be transferred to a secure rear position if she preferred. Voss said she wanted Yale to know both options were available, and neither one was the right answer. It was Yale's choice. Yale asked what the response operation was. Voss said she would explain, but she wanted Yale to hear it fully before deciding anything about her own placement. She pulled a data tablet from her jacket and set it on the table between them. What Yale was about to hear, Voss said, was classified at the highest level of Terran government security. It had been classified that way for almost 200 years. Most citizens did not know it existed. Most members of the Colonial Assembly did not know it existed. Even most military officers did not know it existed. The information was known only to the serving members of the Strategic Reserve Command, the heads of the 3 founding Earth nations that had built the system, and, for the last century, to successive secretaries general, who received a sealed briefing within 48 hours of taking office. The system was called Protocol Verdun. Yale had never heard the name. Voss told her the history of it. She told her about the Vega massacre 217 years ago, when an early human colony world was destroyed in a conflict with a species called the Kethdar. 11,000 colonists lost. And about the aftermath of that event, when the survivors and the families of the victims and the governments that had failed to prevent it gathered in emergency session and made a decision that no democratic process would ever have reached through normal channels. They decided to build something that could not be argued out of, voted out of, or negotiated away from. The decision was this. Any deliberate mass casualty event targeting humans by a hostile non-human actor would trigger an automatic, pre-planned, pre-built military response that no government body, no command authority, and no individual officer could stop once it had been activated. The response would be calibrated to the event. It would be delivered without warning. And it would be delivered regardless of any diplomatic developments that occurred after the triggering event. The logic, as explained by the architects who had built Protocol Verdun and preserved in the founding documents, was simple. Deterrence only worked if it was certain. A deterrent that could be negotiated away in the moment was not a deterrent. It was a bargaining position. And bargaining positions invited the exact kind of probing, testing behavior that the Vreth had just demonstrated at Kessler 7. The only way to make a species understand the true cost of killing humans was to make the response a mechanical fact, like gravity. Not a choice, not a threat. A law 47 people had been on Kessler 7. The response had therefore been calibrated to 47. Yale asked what that meant. Voss said that the Strategic Reserve maintained a system of 47 Lagrange cannons distributed across the outer orbital envelope of human-controlled space. The term cannon was a simplification. They were mass driver platforms, each one capable of accelerating a large kinetic impactor to a velocity that made conventional defense systems essentially irrelevant. They were preloaded. They were pre-targeted through a continuously updated intelligence system. And they were fold-capable, meaning they could be transferred through fold space to a delivery position without traveling there conventionally. When the Kessler 7 beacon had fired on the military channel, the reserve's automated system had verified the incident, classified it as a trigger event, and begun the targeting process. By the time Yale had been brought aboard the Carthage, the 47 impactors were already approaching the destination. Yale sat with this for a moment. She noticed that her hands were very still in her lap, which was unusual. Normally, her hands moved when she was thinking. She asked Voss a question that she had been turning over since Voss had first used the word automated. She said, "Does it feel strange to you, commanding something that you cannot stop?" Voss looked at her for a moment before answering. Then she said, "I do not command it, no one does. That is the point." She said that the hardest thing about Protocol Verdun, for the people who knew about it, was not the weight of what it did. It was the absence of weight. There was no moment of decision. There was no order to give. The process ran, and you watched it run, and your job was not to lead it but to be present as its representative, to be the human face of something that had been decided a long time ago, by people who were also, in their own time, trying to answer an unanswerable question. Yale asked what the unanswerable question was. Voss said, "How do you make the universe understand that the people on your outposts are not expendable?" She stood up and said she would have someone escort Yale to a bridge terminal, if Yale still wanted to be there. She said she would understand if Yale wanted to be taken somewhere quieter instead. Yale said she wanted to be on the bridge. She thought about Dr. Femi. She thought about the data burst sent to New Cairo Archive. All those years of ring dust research preserved in a server somewhere. And the 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who had a mother for 6 years and then did not. She thought about what it meant to build a machine that turned grief into a physical law. She was not sure how she felt about it. She was not sure she was supposed to feel one clear thing. She followed the escort through the wide, clean corridors of the Carthage to the bridge, and she took her position at the survivor witness terminal, and she watched the clock tick down. At hour 3, a Vreth diplomatic vessel appeared on the sensor grid and transmitted an offer. Resources, territorial concessions, access to certain closed travel corridors. The offer was detailed and represented. Voss's communications officer confirmed. A significant material value by any standard. Voss did not respond. Yale watched this and understood, for the first time in a way that was physical rather than intellectual, what it meant to have no off switch. The Vreth were offering things, real things probably, and there was nobody on this bridge who could take the offer, not because they were not authorized, but because authorization was not the mechanism here. The mechanism had already moved past the point where offers were relevant. The Vreth were sending messages to a process, not to people. She wondered if any of the Vreth commanders had worked that out yet. At hour 4, she asked Voss what the Vreth would do when they understood it. Voss said, "Probably the same thing everyone does when they understand it. They will remember it." At hour 5, the sensor officer reported fold signatures emerging from positions across the surrounding light-year envelope. The impactors had been traveling in fold space since the process began. They were now emerging into normal space on final approach vectors. The targeting data that Velharik would never fully confirmed what the reserve's intelligence system had known for decades. The Vreth Homeworld's defense grid had been extensively mapped. The delivery trajectories had been calculated around those maps. Yale looked at the sensor display showing 47 small returns moving on converging vectors. 47. One for each person she had called on the comms and gotten no answer. Carl Bishop, Grace Holloway, Pete Garland, Dr. Anufemi, Oliver Watts. 39 others she had known by face and name, and the small daily texture of 14 months in the same enclosed space. 47 people who had been a Category 2 soft target, low risk, low value. She thought about that risk assessment. She thought about whoever had written it, in some office somewhere, filling out a standard form. The clock hit 0. Nobody on the bridge spoke. On the sensor display, 47 returns reached their vectors and resolved. Across several light years of space, in the core of Vreth territory, something that had been whole was no longer whole. The surface feeds that Sekvarath was watching cut out, one by one, in sequence. Voss's voice came over ship-wide comms level and clear. Protocol Verdun is complete. Use cartage will hold position and receive any Vreth vessel broadcasting distress or surrender signal. Yale looked at her hands, still in her lap. Then she looked at the debris field visible through the bridge observation port. The outer ring of the Helion drift, where Kessler 7 had been. The amber light still scattered across the ice dust, the gas giant still turning, unchanged. 47 Lagrange cannons. 47 names on 47 hulls, laser-etched per reserve protocol. She had not known about the names until the comms officer had mentioned it quietly while the clock was still running. The protocol required it. Each delivery vehicle was marked with the name of one person from the triggering incident. It was not tactical, it served no military function. It had been in the protocol since the beginning, written in by people who had survived the Vega massacre and understood that the difference between a weapon and a consequence was whether it remembered who it was for. 47 names, she said them quietly, one by one, into the silence of the bridge. Nobody stopped her. Nobody turned to look, she said all 47 of them. When she finished, Voss was standing a few feet away. Yale had not heard her move. Voss did not say anything. She stood there for a moment and then returned to her command station. On the sensor grid, the Vreth fleet was breaking apart, not in attack, in retreat. Ships folding out in fragments, disordered in a way that Vel Herrick would later describe as the first recorded instance of Vreth Hive fleet cohesion failure in any engagement in the contact zone historical record. The hive mind structure, which depended on proximity and continuous chemical signaling between castes, did not handle information like this well. It was not designed for it. A single Vreth ship remained after the fleet had gone. Sekvarath's flagship. The comms board lit up with an incoming transmission in universal syntax, broken and imperfect, and Voss read it and then she said it aloud to the bridge. Why did you name them? The bridge was quiet. Voss looked at the transmission for a moment, and then she looked at Yale. Yale shook her head. It was not her answer to give. Voss opened the channel. Because they had names, she said. The Vreth flagship folded out. The Helion drift was empty of alien ships for the first time since this had begun. The debris of Kessler 7 continued its long arc. The gas giant turned. The ice dust caught the light. Yale stayed at her terminal until the shift change. She did not sleep that night. She was thinking about what Voss had said earlier. How do you make the universe understand that the people on your outposts are not expendable? She did not have an answer. She was not sure the answer mattered as much as the question. What mattered was that 47 people had existed, and had been known, and had been counted. And the universe now understood what that counting meant. She thought it might understand for a very long time. The Interstellar Assembly met in session at the New Geneva complex on Earth, in a chamber that had been built to hold 500 delegates and currently held approximately 340, the rest being absent for reasons that the diplomatic record would later classify, with considerable understatement, as ongoing situational assessment. Yale Okafor arrived at the chamber on a Tuesday morning in March, 1 year and 11 days after the Kessler 7 incident. She was wearing her Frontier security dress uniform, which she had not worn in over a year, which had required careful pressing the night before. She carried no documents, she had no prepared statement. She had been asked to testify as an eyewitness and survivor, and she had accepted because Dr. Claire Yates had told her, in a follow-up consultation 6 months earlier, that testifying would be useful for her, and because a woman named Grace Holloway had walked into a crisis without hesitation and never walked out. And the least Yale could do was walk into a room of delegates and tell them the truth. The chamber was striking in its architecture, a wide curved bowl with tiered seating, and a central floor for speakers, all of it faced in pale stone that absorbed sound in a way that made the room feel simultaneously vast and intimate. The delegate sections were marked with species identifiers in 31 different scripts. Yale had never been in the assembly before. She took a moment to look at the room before taking her position. She identified the Vreth section. There were 12 delegates seated there. Not from the warrior caste, but from the colony castes. The subspecies groups that had been distributed across secondary worlds, far enough from the homeworld to have survived what had happened. She looked at them, she did not look away. The session chair, a tall Kalian diplomat named Elena Ruiz, who had been managing interstellar assembly proceedings for 11 years, called the session to order and introduced Yale by her full name and rank and the specific nature of her witness status. Then she asked Yale to begin. Yale stood at the speaker's position in the center of the floor and looked around the chamber. She started with the simple facts. Outpost Kessler 7, Helion Drift System, Outer Orion Spur, 47 personnel, Research Facility Category 2. Her name was Yale Okafor. She had been stationed there for 14 months as part of a 6-person security detail. On the date in question, a Vreth scouting force had arrived without prior notice and without any communications and had systematically taken the outpost apart. She had survived in an emergency pod because her section chief, Grace Holloway, had put her inside it and sealed the door and gone to help the civilian sections instead. She paused there. She described Grace Holloway, not her rank or her file designation. Her height, the way she had of giving instructions, in a tone that sounded like a suggestion even when it was an order. The coffee she always kept at the corner of her desk that was always cold because she forgot to drink it while she was working. She described Pete Garland's terrible coffee and the way everyone drank it anyway, because it was the outpost's most reliable social ritual. She described Dr. Anu Femi's research, the ring dust microecosystem, the data she had preserved in the archive before the end, the 7-year-old daughter on Earth. She went through all 47, not their roles, not their security classifications, or their research outputs, or their mission-relevant skills. Who they were in the small daily sense she had prepared for this. She had contacted families and colleagues, and read the memorial submissions that had been filed in the aftermath. She had 47 small portraits, assembled from other people's memories, and she placed every one of them in that chamber. It took 45 minutes, nobody interrupted. When she finished with the 47 people, she spoke about Protocol Verdun. She was, as far as the assembly record showed, the first civilian survivor witness in the system's history ever to publicly describe the full mechanics of the protocol in an open session. It had been declassified 3 months after the Kessler 7 response, by a vote of the Earth Council, on the grounds that further secrecy served no function. The vote had passed with a significant majority. The minority had argued that disclosure would generate fear and instability. The majority had argued that the universe had already learned what the protocol did, and it seemed unreasonable to continue pretending it didn't exist. Yale described the founding of the Strategic Reserve in the aftermath of Vega. She described the reasoning of the architects, the logic of irreversibility, the decision to build a consequence rather than a threat, to remove the human element from the response loop, precisely because the human element was what made deterrence negotiable. She did not editorialize, she stated the facts. Then she described what it had felt like to sit on the bridge of the Carthage and watch the clock run. Not heroic, not clean, she had not felt righteous. She had felt the specific, particular weight of being in a situation where the outcome was already determined, and the only question was whether you were present for it or not. And she had chosen to be present because the 47 people she had named would not have chosen to look away. The Vreth delegate requested to speak. Session Chair Ruiz acknowledged the request. The delegate stood. He was from the Reef Colony caste, which was the oldest of the surviving Vreth subspecies groups, and he was, by Vreth standards, very old. His name translated roughly as something meaning long patient water, and the interpreter rendered it as Elder Delegate Vashon. Elder Delegate Vashon looked at Yale for a moment across the chamber floor. He said, in the careful measured syntax of someone speaking a second language with considerable effort, "Do humans believe what was done was just?" Yale had been expecting different questions. She had prepared for questions about proportionality frameworks, for arguments about the scale of the response relative to the initial incident, for the legal and political arguments that she had been reading about for months in the Assembly's preliminary debate documents. She had prepared for adversarial questions. She had not specifically prepared for this one. She stood with it for a moment. She was aware of the 340 delegates watching. She was aware that this answer was going to be quoted and argued about, and cited in diplomatic documents for a very long time. She said, "I believe my crew thought they would live. I believe the Vreth believed they would not matter. One of those beliefs was wrong. We built something to make sure it stayed wrong." Elder Delegate Vashon sat down. He did not ask a follow-up question. Yale did not know if that was understanding or something else. She suspected it was something that did not translate well. There were other questions. Proportionality arguments as she had expected. A delegate from the Thesian Federation, raised the question of whether an automated system of this nature was compatible with the Assembly's foundational principles of deliberate governance. Yale said that she was not a legal expert, and that the Earth Council had submitted detailed documentation on that question which she was confident the Assembly would examine thoroughly. She was a frontier security sergeant who had been in a pod in a debris field. She could only speak to what she had directly experienced. A delegate from the Keth Confederacy, seated to a section that had been very quiet throughout the session, asked whether humanity intended to maintain Protocol Verdun going forward, or whether the Kessler 7 response had been a one-time use of a system that would now be dismantled. Yale said she could not speak for Earth's government policy. Then she decided that was not the whole answer. She said she personally believed Protocol Verdun would remain in place, because the conditions that had caused it to be built had not changed. Species that treated human lives as low-value variables in an expansion calculus had not stopped existing. The Vreth were not unique in their logic. The Kessler 7 incident was not the first time humans had been treated as acceptable collateral by non-human actors. It was the first time the response had been large enough for the Assembly to notice. The Keth Confederacy delegate sat down. Yale noticed that several other delegates from sections she would need the Assembly seating chart to identify had shifted positions very slightly in their seats during that exchange. She noted it and filed it away. Session Chair Ruiz asked if there was anything Yale wanted to add before closing her testimony. Yale thought about Dr. Fehme's last transmission. The data burst to New Cairo Archive, the 6 years of research preserved, the 2 words at the end. She said there was one more thing she wanted the Assembly to understand. She said that there was a secondary component to Protocol Verdun that had not been included in the Earth Council's declassification documents. She was disclosing it now, with the full knowledge of the Reserve Command, because the Earth Council had decided that if they were going to be honest about what they had built, they should be completely honest. The secondary component was this: if Earth itself was ever destroyed or made uninhabitable by a deliberate hostile act, the Strategic Reserve's automated system would respond in kind. Fully automated, fully irreversible, no living human would need to issue any order. The system had been designed this way because the architects of Protocol Verdun had understood that a consequence architecture was only complete if it extended in all directions. You could not build a system that protected colony outposts, but left the origin world vulnerable, without creating an incentive to simply bypass the outposts and strike at the source. The Homeworld had therefore been included in the framework from the beginning. This had been true for 200 years. No human government had ever announced it. No ambassador had ever mentioned it in negotiations. No diplomatic document had ever referenced it. It had simply existed, a second law hidden inside the first, waiting for no one to ever need to discover it. The chamber was very quiet. Yale said, "We built it and we hoped we would never have to use it. For 200 years nobody made us use it. We had hoped that would continue. We are still hoping." She looked across the floor at Elder Delegate Vachon. He was looking back at her. She said, 47 people on an outpost in the Helion Drift thought they would live. They had names. All 47 of them had names, and families, and work they cared about, and coffee they made poorly, and research they wanted to finish. They were not a data point. They were never a data point. They were people who woke up in the morning and expected to still be alive by the end of the day. She paused. She said, "Now the galaxy knows what we built to make sure that expectation was worth something." She stepped back from the speaker's position. The chamber remained quiet for longer than was customary. Session Chair Ruiz waited an extra 30 seconds before moving to call the session to recess, and Yale suspected later that Ruiz had needed the time as much as anyone else in the room. Yale walked through the aisle toward the exit doors. She passed close to the Vreth delegate section. Elder Delegate Vachon was watching her as she passed. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. Then she nodded once slowly. He did not nod back. She did not expect him to, not today. Maybe not for a long time. She pushed through the exit doors into the corridor, which was full of assembly staff and diplomatic aides and journalists kept at a distance by security personnel. And the particular electric quiet of an institution that had just heard something it was going to be working through for a long time. She walked through it, and out the far end into a courtyard where the morning light was coming through clear and clean over the city. She stood there for a moment. She thought about Dr. Fehme saying, "Tell them we were here." She thought about Carl Bishop choosing a different route through the corridors. She thought about Grace Holloway sealing the pod door from the outside, calm and final, a task that needed doing. She thought about Pete Garland's terrible coffee and the way everybody loved it because it was theirs. It was part of the specific texture of being alive in that specific place. The galaxy knew now. 340 delegates in a chamber, and all the networks they fed into. and all the species that would read the transcripts, and all the commanders who would update their operational calculus accordingly. They knew that when a human said every life has a name, they did not mean it as a philosophical statement. They meant it as a promise, and they had built the math to prove it. Yael Okafor stood in the courtyard in the morning light, and she thought of 47 people, and she said their names once more quietly, to no one in particular, and to everyone.